Tynan Portillo presents, featuring the best horror stories of the 19th century. Welcome to the Poe Show Podcast. Narrated by Tynan Portillo. Today's episode, The Hound, with guest narrator Mason Yates.
In my tortured ears, there sounds unceasingly a nightmare wearing and flapping, and a faint, distant baying as of some gigantic hound. It is not dream. It is not, I fear, even madness, for too much has already happened to give me these merciful doubts. St. John is a mangled corpse. I alone know why. And such is my knowledge that I'm about to blow out my brains. For fear I shall be mangled in the same way. Down unlit and illitable corridors of eldritch fantasy sweep the black, shapeless nemesis that drives me to self-annihilation. May heaven forgive the folly and the morbidity which led us both to so monstrous a fate, wearied with the commonplace of a prosaic world, where even the joys of romance and adventure soon grew stale. St. John and I followed enthusiastically every aesthetic and intellectual movement which promised respite from our devastated ennui. The enigmas of the symbolists and the ecstasies of the pre-Raphaelites, all were ours in their time. But each new mood was drained too soon of its diverting novelty and appealed only in somber philosophy of the decadence could hold us. And this we found potent only by increasing gradually the depth and diabolism of our penetrations. Baudelaire and Huysmans were soon exhausted of thrills, till finally they reminded for us only the more directed stimuli for unnatural personal experiences and adventures. It was this frightful emotional need which led us to that detestable course, which even in my present fear I mention with shame and timidity. That hideous extremity of human outrage, the abhorrent practice of grave robbing. I cannot reveal the details of our shocking expeditions, or catalog even partly the worst of trophies adoring the nameless museum which we prepared in the great stone house where we jointly dwelt alone and servantless. Our museum was a blasphemous, unthinkable place, where with the satanic taste of necrotic virtuosi, we had assembled a universe of terror and decay to excite our jaded sensibilities. It was a secret room far, far underground, where huge winged demons, carven of basalt and onyx, vomited from wide grinning mouths, weird green and orange light. A hidden pneumatic pipes ruffled into kaleidoscopic dances of death, though the lines of red charnel things, hand in hand, woven in voluminous black hangings. Though these pipes came at will, the odors are moods most craved, sometimes the scent of pale funeral lilies, sometimes the necrotic incense of imagined Eastern shrines of the kingly dead, and sometimes, how I shudder to recall it, the frightful soul upheaving stench of the uncovered grave. Around the walls of this repellent chamber were cases of antique mummies alternating with calmly lifelike bodies, perfectly stuffed and cured by the taxidermist's art, and with headstones snatched from the oldest churchyards of the world. Niches here and there contain skulls of all shapes and heads preserved in various stages of dissolution. There one might find the rotting bald pates of famous noblemen and the fresh and radiantly golden heads of new buried children. Statues and paintings there were all of fiendish subjects, and some executed by St. John and myself. A locked portfolio, bound in tan human skin, held certain unknown and unnameable drawings, which it was rumored Goya had perpetrated but dared not acknowledge. There was nauseous musical instruments, stringed brass and woodwind, on which St. John and I sometimes produced dissonances of exquisite morbidity and cockamamoniacal ghastliness, whilst in a multitude of inlaid ebony cabinets we posted the most incredible and unimaginable variety of tumult ever assembled by human madness and perversity. It was of this loot in particular that I must not speak. Thank God I had the courage to destroy it long before I thought of destroying myself. The predatory excursions on which we collected our unmentionable treasures were always artistically memorable events. We will know vulgar ghouls, but worked only under certain conditions of mood, landscape, environment, weather, season, and moonlight. These pastimes were to us the most exquisite forms of aesthetic expression, and we gave the details of fastidious technical care an inappropriate hour of jarring lighting effects, or a clumsy manipulation of the damp sod would almost totally destroy us. That ecstatic titillation which followed the exhumation of some ominous grinning secret of the earth. Our quest of novel scenes and piquant conditions was feverish and insatiated. St. John was always the leader, and he it was who led the way, at least to the mocking, that accursed spot, which brought us our hideous and invulnerable doom. By what malign fatality were we lured to that terrible Holland churchyard? I think it was that dark rumor and legendary, the tale of one buried for 5 centuries, who had himself been a ghoul in his time and had stolen a potent thing from a mighty sepulchre. I can recall the scene in these final moments. The pale autumnal moon over the graves, casting long, horrible shadows, the grotesque trees drooping sullenly to meet the neglected grass and the crumbling slabs, the vast legions of strangely colossal bats that flew against the moon, the antique ivory church pointing a huge spectral finger at the livid sky, the phosphorescent insects that danced like death fire under the yews in a distant corner, the odors of mold, vegetation, and less explicable things that mingled feebly with the night wind from over far swamps and seas. The worst of all, the faint, deep tone, baying of some gigantic hound, which we could neither see nor definitely place. As we heard this suggestion of baying, we shuddered, remembering the tales of the peasantry, for he whom sought had centuries before been found in the selfsame spot, torn and mangled by the claws and teeth of some unspeakable beast. I remember how we delved in this ghoul's cave with our spades, and how we thrilled at the picture of ourselves, the grave, the pale witching moon, the horrible shadows, the grotesque trees, the titanic bats, the antique church, the dancing death fires, the sickening odors, the gently moaning night wind, and the strange half-heard directionless baying of whose objective existence we could scarcely be sure. Then we struck a substance harder than damp mold, and behold, a rotting oblong box, crusted with mineral deposit from the long undistributed ground. It was incredibly tough and thick, but so old that we finally pierced it open and feasted our eyes on what it held. Much, amazingly much, was left of the object despite the lapse of 500 years. The skeleton, though crushed in places by the jaws of the thing that killed it, held together with surprising firmness, and we gloated over the clean white skull and its long, firm teeth and its eyeless sockets that once had glowed with a charnel fever like our own. In the coffin, an amulet of curious and exotic design, which had happily been worn around the sleeper's neck. It was oddly conventionalized figure of a crouching winged hound or sphinx with a semi-canine face. It was exquisitely carved in antique oriental fashion from small pieces of green jade. The expression on its features were repellent in the extreme, savoring at once of death, bestiality, and malevolence. Around the base was an inscription of characters which neither St. John nor I could identify. And on the bottom, like a maker's seal, were graven a grotesque and formidable skull. Immediately upon beholding this amulet, we knew that we must possess it. That this treasure alone was our logical pelf from the censured grave. Even had its outlines been unfamiliar, so would have desired it. But as we looked more closely, we saw that it was not wholly unfamiliar, alienated. It is indeed was to all art and literature, which sane and balanced readers know. But we recognized it as the thing hinted of in the forbidden Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazard, the ghastly soul symbol of the corpse-eating cult of its insatiable Lang. In Central Asia, all too well did we trace the sinister lineaments described by the old Arab demonologists. Lineaments. We wrote dawn for some obscure supernatural manifestation of souls of those who vexed and gnawed at the dead. Seizing the green jade object, we gave a last glance at the bleached and carven-eyed face of its owner and close up the cave as we found it. As we hastened from the abhorrent spot, the stolen amulet in St. John's pocket, we thought we saw the bats descend in a body to the earth we had so lightly rifled, as if seeking for some curse and unholy nourishment. But the autumn moon shone weak and pale, and we could not be sure. So too, as we sailed the next day away from Holland to our home, we thought we heard the faint distant baying of some gigantic hound in the background. But the autumn winged moaned sad and wan, and we could not be sure. Less than a week after our return to England, strange things began to happen. We lived as recluses, devoid of friends, alone and without servants, in a few rooms of an ancient manor house on a bleak and unfrequent moor, so that our doors were seldom disturbed by the knock of a visitor. Now, however, we were troubled by what seemed to be frequent fumblings in the night, not only around the doors, but around the windows also, upper as well as lower. Once we fancied the large, opaque body darkened the library window when the moon was shining against it. Another time, we thought we heard a whirring, a flapping sound not far off. Of each occasion, investigations revealed nothing, and we began to ascribe the occurrences of imagination alone. The sane, curiously disturbed imagination, which still prolonged in our ears. The faint far baying we thought we heard in Holland churchyard. The jade amulet now reposed in the niches in our museum, and sometimes we buried strangely scented candles. Before we reached in Al-Hazard's Necronomicon, about its properties and about the relations of ghouls' souls to the object. It symbolized and were disturbed by what we read. Then, terror came. On the night of September 24th, I heard a knock at my chamber door. Fancying it St. John, I bade the knocker enter, but I was only answered by a shrill laugh. There was no one in the corridor. When I aroused St. John from his sleep, he professed entire ignorance of the event and became as worried as I. It was the night that faint, distant bane over the moor, because to us certain and dedicated reality, 4 days later, whilst we were both in the hidden museum, they came to a low, cautious scratching at a single door, which led us to the secret library staircase. Our alarm was now divided, for besides our fear of the unknown, we were always entertained a dread that our grisly collection might be discovered. Extinguishing all lights, we proceeded to the door and threw it suddenly open, whereupon we felt the uncannibal rush of air and heard, as if proceeding far away, a queer combination of rustling, teetering, and articulate chatter. Whether we were mad dreaming, or in our senses we did not try to determine, we only realized with the blackest of apprehensions that apparently disembodied chatter was beyond a doubt in the Dutch language. After that, we lived in growing horror, and fascinated, mostly we held to the theory that we jointly going mad from our lives of unnatural excitements. But sometimes it pleased us more to dramatize ourselves as the victim of some creeping and applied doom. Bizarre manifestations were not too frequent to count. Our lonely house was seemingly alive with the presence of some malign being whose nature we could not guess. And every night that demonic bane rolled over the window-swept moor, always louder and louder. On October 29th, we found in a soft earth underneath the library window a series of footprints, utterly impossible to describe. They were baffling as a horde of great bats, which haunted the old manor house in unprecedented and increasing numbers. The horrors reached a culmination on November 18th, when St. John, walking home after a dark form, was seized by some fearful carnivorous thing and torn to ribbons. His scream have reached the house, and I have hastened to the terrible scene in time to hear a whir of wings and a sea of vague, black, cloudly things silhouetted against the rising moon. My friend was dying when I spoke to him, and he could not answer coherently. All he could do was to whisper,
"The amulet. That damned thing."
Then he collapsed in an instant mass of mangled flesh. I buried him the next midnight in one of our neglected gardens, mumbled over his body one of his devilish rituals that he loved in life, and I pronounced the last demonic sentence I heard afar on the door, the faint baying of some gigantic hound. The moon was up, but I dared not look at it, and when I saw on the dim-lighted moor a wide nebulous shadow sweeping from mound to mound, I shut my eyes and threw myself down upon the ground. When I arose trembling, I know not how much later, I staggered into the house and made shocking obeisances before an enshrined amulet of green jade. Being afraid to live alone in an ancient house on the moor, I departed on the following day for London, taking with me the amulet after destroying by fire and burial the rest of the impetus collection of the museum. But after these nights, I heard the baying again, and before a week over felt strange eyes upon me whenever it was dark. One evening, as I strolled on Victoria Embankment for some needed air, I saw a black shape obscuring one of the reflections of the lamps in the water. A wind stronger than the night wind rushed by, and I knew that what was befallen St. John must soon befall me. The next day, I carefully wrapped the green jade amulet and sailed from Holland. What mercy I might gain by returning this thing to its silent, sleeping owner, I know not. But I feel that I must at least try any step conceivably logical. What the Hound was, and why pursue me, were questions still vague, but I had first heard the baying in the ancient churchyard, and every subsequent included St. John's dying whisper. It served to connect a curse with the stealing of the amulet. Accordingly, I sank into the netherest abyss of despair. When, at an inn in Rotterdam, I discovered that thieves had despoiled me of this sole means of salvation. The baying was loud that evening, and in the morning I read of the nameless deed in the vilest quarter of the city. The rebel were in terror, from upon an evil tenement had fallen a red death beyond the foulest previous crime of the neighborhood. In the squalorous thieves' den, an entire family have been torn to shreds by an unknown thing which left no trace, and those around had heard all night above the unusual glamour of drunken voices a faint deep note as of a gigantic hound. So last I stood in the unwholesome churchyard where a pale winter moon crested hideous shadows and lifeless trees drooped sullenly to meet the withered, frosty grass and cracking slabs, and the ivory church pointed a jarring finger at the unfriendly sky, and the night wind howled from over frozen swamps and frigid seas. The baying very faint now, as it ceased altogether, and I approached the ancient grave I had once violated and frightened away an abnormally large horde of bats, which had been hovering curiously around it. I know not why I meant thither unless to pray or gibber out pleas and apologies to the calm white thing that laid within. But wherever my reason, I attacked the half-frozen sod with a desperation partly mine and partly that of dominating will outside myself. Excavation was much easier than I expected, though at one point I encountered a queer interruption when a lean vulture darted down out of the cold sky and pecked at the grave until I killed him with a blow of my spade. Finally, I reached the rotting oblong box and removed the damp nitrous cover. This is the last rational act I ever performed. From crouched within the certified coffin, embraced by a closed, panicked nightmare retinue of huge, sinewy, sleeping bats, was the bony thing my friend and I robbed. Not clean and placid, as if we seen it then, but covered with caked blood and shreds of alien flesh and hair, and leering satiently at me with phosphorant sockets and sharp, ensanguined fangs, yawning twistedly in mockery of my doom. And when from those grinning jaws a deep, sardonic bay, as of some gigantic hound, and I saw that I have hold in its gory, filthy claws the lost, fearful amulet of green jade, I merely screamed and ran away idiotically. My scream soon dissolved into laughter. Madness, rise, the star wind, claws and teeth sharpened on century of corpses, dripping death astride a bacchanal of bats. From night black ruins of buried temple Belial. Now, as the bane of the dead, fleshless monstrosity grows louder and louder, and the stealthy wearing and flapping of those accursed webbed wings circles closer and closer. I shall seek with my revolver the oblivion only refuge for the unnamed and unnameable.
I'd like to give another thanks to Mason Yates for narrating this episode. He recorded the vocals on his own and did most of the editing on his own, then sent it over to me and I added the sound effects and the music. I hope now you'll enjoy the after talk that we shared about the episode. Okay, we're going on take 2 now because I thought we were recording and we weren't. So, all right, Mason, welcome yet again to the Post Show Podcast. Thanks for coming on.
I'm more and so happy to be here. We're having a blast.
We were like halfway through the questions too, and so it's just going to be reiterating the same stuff. Oh, that's just fun. Okay, well... It's going to feel awkward asking you these questions now. Okay. What was your favorite part of the story and why?
The aspect of him slowly descending into madness, definitely that's my favorite part, is definitely the descent into madness and having those interesting experiences until he's finally like, my insanity can't handle this no more.
Since we're on that theme right now, is there a moral that you think the author was advocating for in the story? And if not, why not? If so, why so? Because I feel like if there is a moral, personally, it's something like a warning against doing evil, against evil actions, and saying even if you regret it afterwards, even if you say sorry, even if you want to, start over, you won't be able to. You can't. And I feel like that's what this story was trying to get at, even though the main character was constantly trying to leave it all behind him. He couldn't because the Hound was always after him, maybe saying that some kind of cosmic justice is always going to make people pay who should have paid. I don't know if that was the moral, though. I feel like this was a story where Lovecraft just kind of wrote it and then tossed it out, It didn't really seem like an important story to me in the way that he wrote it.
Like kind of like what we said before, like his more of his thing was the eldritch horror and the more of the gods, right? Him building that fantasy, because I think with that, like the fear of the unknown is huge. I just think, just no one resonates, but we all can pick and choose what we get to resonate with, right? And I think with this one, I really like like I said before, just the steps of madness and how he was struggling with the Hound.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to clarify for everyone listening, the decadence movement, to my understanding at least, was the time in literature that was meant to really fancy everything up. A tree in a field is not a tree in a field. It's a great oak being thousands of years old that has its mouth pressed against the earth, sucking from it the life of being and stuff like that. So it was all about fancying up the language, and I'm pretty sure because they wanted wealthier people to read the stories. But that was why a lot of the writing in this story especially was very fancy and very long words, very interesting words, because he modeled it after the decadence movement. And for anyone who doesn't know, the inspiration for this story actually came from he went to a church, and he went to the graveyard that they had in the back, and he saw a symbol on a gravestone, and he just chipped it off and took it. He just did that, and then to write a story about it, he put it under his pillow to be inspired to write the story, which is like, that's like messed up to me. But it's also like, I don't know, maybe this story was supposed to be how he felt guilt about that. I kind of doubt that because I feel like he wasn't trying to express guilt. But that's what led to this story, which is real interesting. It was also published in 1924 in the issue of Weird Tales, and I saw a lot of research saying it reflects a lot of Edgar Allan Poe's writing and his phrasing. And especially in this story, it talks about knocking at a chamber door and the Red Death, the oblong box. And I think that especially Poe's writing, being such an influential American writer, I feel like a lot of writers tend to emulate their predecessors, and that's what Lovecraft was doing here. But do you think this story would have been any more scary being published now?
Well, I just think in general, like from the time period of just like the language and stuff, 1924, let's just sit there and think there for a second. You know, the Great Depression, I think, happens in 1928 or 9, somewhere. I could be wrong. You know, people who look at this are probably like, oh, no, it's actually this date. But, you know, coming out of, this is the happiest time ever. The Roaring 20s were, people were discovering new dances, and there was no, like the country was booming, everyone's loving life, and then here's this, you know, this guy, he's like, hey, there's the fear of the unknown, there's eldritch horrors, they hear these crazy crap, and people are going like, oh snap, like, hold up, let's think about it, like, how would you know that I don't know, that you don't know that's real? You know what I mean? And I think that's kind of the way you can play on it more, because the option of less information. For instance, I think now in this time of age, we are so, when we don't know something, what do? We have Google. We look it up. Yeah. Right? I think we are very, what's the word I'm thinking of? Like, we are very, in a moment's instant, we can look up a question in another language, another thing. And in that time, how did you learn information back then? Books, right? Going to school. No kid now these days, you know, they're not going to be interested, because like now in this time of age of like, oh, did you go and watch like a show that has an interesting character, blah, 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 and they kind of talk about it and it's posted through like TikTok or Facebook or something interesting, right?
Yeah, and I think that's why Cthulhu and a lot of the eldritch beings have lasted so long, because they specifically represent the unknown. You know, it's kind of that thing where it's like, well, you can't prove it doesn't exist. I guess it is worth mentioning that this was the first story to mention the Necronomicon, this book of horror, of eldritch power that has knowledge of all these beings and can summon them. I feel like Lovecraft also was trying to introduce more things with this story, but he wrote this off as a, quote, piece of junk, this story. I don't know if he just didn't like writing it, or if he did it for money, or if he just didn't like it afterwards. He personally wrote that about his story. So why a hound? What kind of symbolism do you think a hound with wings and all these bats following it around, like why a creature like that? Just to make something as scary as possible?
Well, instantly with the Hound, maybe didn't like it as much because he couldn't use and pull what he really wanted from like his eldritch horror, like his gods, because it's like maybe he was like, oh, well, it wouldn't make sense if, you know, if I had Cthulhu, like, oh, well, Cthulhu's in the ocean, so it wouldn't make sense for him to be on land. You know what I mean? So that's kind of like the certain things why he probably thought it was trash, because he couldn't pull from his true and funner things that he wanted to do of the Cthulhu and all his other eldritch horror like gods. But I still had fun doing it, and I just think with the wings, like maybe trying to show that this thing can fly, which is crazy because, like, you know, at that time it's like dogs don't fly, and I think there's even an eldritch horror story where he has it where can't remember the character's name, but the dude's so dumb that he realized like all the creatures and all the eldritch gods that he's seen, he's like, well, that dog's broken, you know? Like
Yeah, I think that the symbolism of the creature is specifically just supposed to be something to creep you out. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be anything deeper than that. It doesn't seem like it, especially because there's nothing in reference to it in the story, you know? Like, usually if an author wants someone to think about something else, they'll have a pretty clear analogy. Like, Edgar Allan Poe really likes to use analogies for Adam and Eve in the garden to represent the purest form of innocence and happiness. But then with Lovecraft, Cthulhu usually represents, like you said, the fear of the unknown, the big threat, the existentialism that we all feel. With the Hound, I'm not really getting any of that. You know, it's maybe a hound because it's on the hunt. So I can see that. And then wings because it's creepy. I mean, I honestly can't think of another reason why it would be a hound. Last thing I want to touch on is, why do you think we as readers and watchers of TV and people who enjoy entertainment, why do we enjoy the topic of things that are scary or people going mad? What is your opinion on that?
I truly believe it's so intriguing because this whole time, where are we right now? We're you know, obviously on planet Earth. traveling throughout the cosmos and like galaxy, imagine if we could do that. There'd be less fear because you'd be more knowledgeable. I think that's just in human beings in general. Like when we don't know something, what do we tend to do? Either A, try to figure it out, B, destroy that something because we don't like it, or C, we study it. And I think that's why just kind of so people are obsessed with space.
And that reminds me of, I'm pretty sure it was H.G. Wells that wrote War of the Worlds, and it was aired on the radio. So it was a radio show, right? But it was dramatizing everything. So it's like, we interrupt your program to bring you this, and it was that kind of thing. But since it was on the radio and so many people tuned in, they thought it was real. They thought the world was ending because Martians had attacked. It caused a nationwide panic. People were telling their neighbors and their family, they were sending whatever they sent, telegrams, to tell people to tune into this radio because we're under attack. It was nationwide panic. And that's just what came to my mind when you were talking about the fear of the unknown. When we know it, then that fear goes away. So now we know there's water on Mars. That's what we know, basically. There's not really life, but hey, there could have been life. There could have been. So now we've got new questions. What happened before? What happens after? What can we do on Mars? And so exactly what you were saying, that fear of the unknown, as we get to know it, we become less afraid of it, but it leads to these new questions. But what about like going mad? Because, for instance, The Raven, first episode ever on this podcast, a character is so lost in his own sorrow of losing his Lenore, his one true love, that he falls into mental ruin. Why is that subject? Why are crazy people or people losing their minds so interesting to us?
I just think madness in general it's intriguing because it's creepy.
And you said it sounds weird to be so interested in crazy people. I mean, there are Netflix documentaries on Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy. They get millions of people watching him. Why? Because we're interested. We want to know, why did this person think that they could just get away with it? What is wrong with their brain? So I feel like we're all pretty interested in that, but I think it also depends on time period, because the original novel, And Then There Were None, was published and it was written by Agatha Christie, a great novel. Everyone dies at the end. And when they made the first movie for it, it was 1945. And that was just after World War II. No one wanted to go and see a movie where everyone died. They wanted a happy movie, so in the movie they had a young couple that gets together at the end and they run off into the sunset. It's a happy ending. Time period is always going to influence the writer, of course. Like it subconsciously, no matter what we do, our time periods are going to influence our writing. There are just certain topics that aren't going to sell as well because people don't want to read it, which is, apparent in the 1945 film, and it's apparent in stories today. All right. Very last thing, Mason, where can people find you on social media?
My handle is Mason_Jackson911. But that's really it. I will, probably in the future, will make one for, the lovely thing that me and you are trying to go into. So, keep in tune for that, people who follow me. Right now, that's when you can, find me at, and yeah.
Thank you, Mason, for coming.
Of course, man. I had a really fun opportunity, and thank you for letting me to go and do this. Thank you for taking me under your wing, and I really, respect you. So thank you so much. So.
You're welcome, man. Thanks for coming on. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Poe Show podcast. If you liked it, consider liking the episode and subscribing. If you have any story suggestions or questions about the episode or the process that goes into each episode, and of course I would love to have any of your suggestions for future episodes, please email poeshowpod@gmail.com. That's poeshowpod@gmail.com, and I'll address any questions that you have in the next episode, and I would love to air some fan-requested stories. Feel free to follow the podcast on Instagram at The Poe Show Podcast, because we will start posting sneak peeks at the next episode, and you'll be able to stay up to date on the latest episodes and upcoming content. You can also look forward to a couple bonus episodes on this podcast just to celebrate the spectacular spooky season. The link to the Post Show Patreon is always going to be in the episode info. If you consider becoming a patron, you can get a shout out on an episode, you'll gain access to exclusive bonus content and exclusive episodes, and it always helps to support the podcast. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you in the next one on the Post Show Podcast.